Snakes are fascinating animals that come in various shapes and forms, providing us with a variety of different species to choose from. They serve as a really great drawing exercise and have often been seen as these ominous creatures. However, they are quite versatile and can be utilized in many different artworks such as horror, fantasy, or even just natural landscapes, which makes them a really great visual tool to have in your drawing repertoire. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another unique art tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's tutorial, we will be breaking down the process of how to draw a realistic snake. In this case, we will be working with a digital device. However, all the drawing steps can be transferred to traditional materials as long as you work with a layering process and materials that are conducive to that kind of drawing process. So with that being said, the way in which we're going to start this tutorial is we're going to start by forming the snake in its basic shape. Now, we basically want to start with a very loose sketch where we aim to capture the basic shape and proportions of the snake. Now, snakes are quite homogeneous in shape. However, they do have a very specific type of cube-like cylindrical structure. So we want to think of a unique pose or movement to give a little bit more of a nuanced quality to our drawing. In this case, we are establishing a little bit of a striking pose in this particular drawing, but you can use a reference image to assist you in terms of what unique pose you would like in your own snake drawing. Naturally, this means the snake will be coiled up in this particular pose. Again, very unique to this particular drawing. However, we do want to think about the actual position of our snake as we kind of establish a loose sketch. Now, once again, the snake is quite tube-like, but it does become a little bit more rectangular as it kind of grounds itself to a surface, naturally causing the weight of its body to make it slightly more flat as it kind of hits the ground. But otherwise, we can kind of keep the generalized sketch for now very loosely, kind of establishing this tube-like structure. And once we have established the general outline of our snake drawing, we can then proceed to lightly erase the drawing, leaving behind some ghost lines. This will basically help us or assist us as we refine the drawing of the snake. Now, the next step is refining the snake sketch. So we want to start working from the head of the snake and slowly refining the outline of the snake sketch. This is where we start to basically bring more form to the unique features such as the fangs, eyes, and head shape. Now again, snakes are quite tube-like or cylindrical in their bodies. However, they have this squarish quality, and we really want to capture this very subtle detail in their body to kind of emphasize a weightiness to their muscular form. So snakes do have this kind of slightly flattened underbelly, and it's just something to kind of bear in mind as you form your snake in a more realistic fashion. But otherwise, as we continue, just make sure to take your time with that snake outline structure, making sure you create a proportionally correct shape within your snake, and also making sure the end of the tail becomes slightly more narrow as we come to the end. Now, there are various species to draw inspiration from. In this case, we are kind of working with more of a loose representation of a viper-like snake. But again, you can kind of follow this process with any kind of snake drawing you are interested in, or any kind of snake species, any reference image that appeals to you. Otherwise, the next step we're going to do is start adding in some color and detail to the head of the snake. Now, a good suggestion is to always kind of work in two parts with the snake, seeing the head as its own structure to kind of solidify and finish, and then slowly moving into the body as the body becomes more of this homogeneous structure that is separate from the snake. Now, this is where we start to set the undertone of color as we slowly start to establish the colors and their various tonal values within the head of the snake. So this is where we also can decide on the coloration of our snake's skin. In this particular drawing, we're working with light browns and yellows to kind of represent a more classic wilderness type of snake color. Again, you can really choose from various snake species, and you can follow the same process for any colored snake that you choose. But as we continue, we want to be quite light with the application of color at this point, as we are simply trying to understand which areas are lighter and darker in the snake. We can carry this color palette throughout the entire snake structure to maintain consistency as well. Otherwise, the mouth of the snake is often quite pink and fleshy, so we want to try and capture this quality within the mouth. We also want to build up the details within a spectrum of pink and red. So naturally, when we look into a snake's mouth, we'll see that it does have this exposed organ-like coloration, where we see a lot of reds and pinks, and it tends to be quite moist. So the idea is to really build up these kinds of colors, or working within that kind of spectrum of color, and then slowly working our way towards highlights to represent a moisture within the mouth. Again, we can take our time with this, but we can start to bring more structure to the different features within the mouth, such as the fangs and the web-like structure connecting the upper and lower jaw. We can also consider working in a pattern along the top surface area of the face, as this can set the tone for the rest of the body and the reoccurring drawing pattern. Now once again, it is good to kind of look at some reference images. There are various patterns to choose from when looking at different snake species, but the idea is to kind of maintain this as a reoccurring thing to have a consistency within the entire snake drawing. Another good suggestion is to add some light hues of pink to create more reflective qualities that represent moisture once again within the moist areas of the inner mouth, and this is going to just give it a more realistic effect in terms of venom or saliva that is sitting in the mouth of the snake. We can also start representing the eyes more distinctly with an outline and a pupil. The eyes tend to be slightly darker, but we can integrate some highlights to represent that glassy surface area of the eye. Take your time defining the head and the patterns that move along the surface area of the face. We also want to think about using darker browns and lighter yellows for more three-dimensionality within the actual structure of the snake. Now naturally, when you're working with colors, you always want to think about shadow and highlight as these two concepts at the end of the same spectrum. So if you're working with a specific color, you want to think about what the darker tonal value of that color is to represent shadow. In this case, maybe yellows can shift into browns to represent obviously the shadowed variation of yellow, and then shift into whites to represent the highlight. We want to work with shading and highlights into the yellowish areas of the snake, especially where the head distorts slightly in shape as the mouth extends open. Otherwise, just make sure to take your time building up these layers, slowly working from lighter tonal values and then kind of building up these layers into darker tonal values until the head becomes slightly more three-dimensional and therefore having a more realistic representation of the structure. We can also add white highlights to the mouth to enhance the moist quality inside the mouth, and we can also do this along the surface area of the face, as the scales tend to be quite a reflective type of surface area throughout the entire structure of the body. But as we move on, we're going to start adding color and detail to the body of the snake. Now this will take some time naturally as we slowly start to shift our way into establishing the scales, but for now what we want to do is we want to lightly work in a similar pattern to the face throughout the rest of the body. The intention is to also start working on some brown shading to represent shadows that form around the three-dimensional structure of the snake. So that's where we really start to think about the muscular structure and the weightiness that kind of establishes those ridges that become slightly more rectangular in their tube-like structure. So try to keep these colors and details light for now as you establish them throughout the entire body of the snake. Once we have worked out the color pattern throughout the entire snake drawing, we can now work in some light scale details. Now we want to add these details throughout the entire structure of the snake, starting from the head. Now as we do this, we really want to think about the pattern as laying bricks, that kind of process where we kind of do one row at a time as we add in these little arc shapes row by row. As we complete one row, we can then use it to help establish the placement of the next row of patterns, and this kind of keeps a more consistent pattern shape in the scales throughout the entire body. As long as we go row by row, we will maintain uniformity and consistency as we work our way through the entire cylindrical structure of the snake. By doing this, we will find that we are less likely to make a mistake. It does take long, so you do want to make sure you kind of take breaks in between, but it's just a safer way to kind of represent the scales accurately and kind of achieve a more consistent aesthetic within the scales throughout the entire body structure. We will also find that as we curve around the body, there will be this subtle twisting and distortion within the scales, and this is okay. It actually gives it a slightly more organic and natural feel to how the scales basically misshapen as they curve with the body. This will take some time, but we want to make sure we work these scales throughout the entire body of the snake structure. Once we have added scales to the entire snake structure, we can then proceed to erase the entire body slightly, and then we'll leave a little bit of ghost lines once again before refining the scales and the shading further. Now we're going to continue by refining the scales and the shading one last time. So this is where we can start working with darker browns and black colors to bring more structure to the shape of the scales and the body of the snake. We can be quite vivid at this point with how we add in shadow formations, as this will enhance the three-dimensional quality of the snake and provide good contrast between the highlighted and shadowed areas. We want to be conscious of the direction from which the light source is coming as well to maintain that consistency within the shadow placement of our snake drawing. We can also start to work strategically with line work to emphasize the three-dimensional qualities of the scale. So we can do this basically by defining defining a single side of each scale with a darker line that basically shows the shadowed side of that scale. So this is where we really want to think about which side the shadow formations will be most prominent, and this is where we can emphasize a single side of each scale with some lines, and naturally this is going to just emphasize that three-dimensional quality and create a more realistic representation of those small three-dimensional qualities between each scale. Now as we do this, this means we can move through the body and add these darker lines to each scale as they basically form along the main shadowed areas. This will take some time, but if we are patient and work our way through the entire snake, we will see how it creates a more realistic shape within the scales and therefore a more realistic representation of our snake. We can also keep the shape of the scales quite faint as they shift into the illuminated areas, as this again kind of resembles a more realistic interaction with light in terms of how light slightly flattens three-dimensional structures. Every time we come to the ridges in the body with the stark shadows, with the very vivid shadows, we can then enhance those ridges of each scale with that darker line work. So that's where we really want to think about how the shadows flow into the illuminated areas and then how they slightly kind of work their way through the grooves of the scales. As we proceed with this process throughout the entire body of the snake, we will start to see a more realistic snake drawing start to form. Now just take your time and try to take some breaks as you work your way through the entire structure of the snake. Remember, if you are fatigued, you are more likely to make mistakes, so just take a break if you need to. But otherwise, slowly but surely, these scales will enhance the overall quality of the snake drawing. But just remember to go row by row and slowly think about that bricking motion as you establish the scales throughout the entire structure, and then as you integrate shadow formations, really start to think about which side of each scale would be opposing the light source and therefore can have a little bit more of a darker shadow formation to emphasize their three-dimensional qualities. And then lastly, we're going to move into adding the last details to the snake drawing. So once we have refined the scales, we can slowly work in some darker shading to the pattern throughout the body of the snake with some brown colors. Now as we proceed with these final details, we can darken any shadows and refine the outline of the snake drawing one last time to further emphasize the form of the body. This is where we can actually add in a little bit more groove-like texture along the outline to represent the scales and their three-dimensional qualities as they wrap around the actual outline of the snake. And another good suggestion is to work on the last highlights that form along the scales that are more exposed to the light source. So naturally, in a way that is opposite to that of integrating shadow formations along single sides of scales, we can now do the same but for the highlighted areas that are more illuminated by the light source, where we actually start to add in some white highlights along the larger surface area of each of those scales that are exposed to the light source, rather than integrating shadow formations along the actual ridges between scales. But otherwise, guys, we want to be quite sparing with these highlights, making sure we only add them to the areas of the scales that are lightest in color to not overpower our snake drawing with highlights. And then lastly, just take your time with this detail and try not to overpower the snake drawing. And there you have it, guys, how to draw a snake through a few simple steps. But thanks for tuning in. If you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below if you'd like us to make similar videos on related topics, maybe animals, plant life, nature. You let us know. We'd love to hear back from you guys, and you can show your support by liking and subscribing. This helps us to grow the channel, which enables us to make more art related content for you guys, which we love to do. But thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.